Now in our home component, let's go ahead and add some layout to it so that it automatically scales up and down. Now let's go to index.js, which is our home page, and let's add a div right here, and let's call it styles.card layout, as this will be the layout of the card. Close the div tag. And in addition to that, let's also give the card itself a class name called card so that we can add some styling there too. Now heading over to card.module.css. No, we need to go to home.module.css because that's the CSS we want to fix. So let's head over there and let's create a card layout over here. Also, let's create card here. Now, the layout of the card would be how the cards would get rendered on the page. So for example, in our app, this card component is taking the full width. But what we would like is we should have 3 columns. For example, this is column 1, column 2, and column 3. But the minute we change our window size, we want 2 columns and then finally 1. And notice how the gap between the elements also change based on the breakpoint. Because on a desktop screen, we have more room between the columns. So let's go ahead and create the layout for the card component so that it gets rendered as per the number of columns at specific breakpoints. So the first thing we are going to do is use CSS grids. And CSS grids are essentially a way that you can divide the page in the form of grids. You can position them. So for example, in our app, if we open up DevTools, and let's align this right here so we can see it. And if I select these cards, you can see there are purple lines right here. And it tells us how the CSS grids are applied internally. So the dotted lines around the container is essentially a grid. And it is telling us that, hey, actually, this specific grid is divided into 2 columns. Now, let's go ahead and create something similar for our card layout. Now, let's go ahead and add some more styling. So what we would like is, by default, since this is a mobile first development, by default, this is a mobile device. So what we want is, we want to say grid template columns to repeat once with a min max of 0, 1 FR. And what this would do is it would set the column to be 1. And we want the column gap, that is, the gap between the rows would be row gap and the gap between the columns would be column gap, would be 1.5 rem. Similarly, a row gap should be 1.5 rem as well. All right. And the card itself, since we want the card to be centered, let's give it justify content center. And what justify content would do is it will align the elements to the center of the container. That is the layout here. In our browser, let's check it out. And you can see that this card, it's actually in the center of the page. Now let's add more card items so we can see how the layout is applied. Going to index.js and copying the same card again. Going back, you can see now that the cards are one below the other. So why is that? It's because we said that by default it's going to be 1 column, remember? And let's now, in order to change it to be 3 columns at this breakpoint, let's go ahead and change the grid template columns. All right, back to home.module.css. What we can do is we can essentially copy this div and paste it right here. We don't need to declare the grid or anything like that again, but we can say repeat 3 times or 2 times rather, because it's a 640 pixel. And copying this again, we can say in 768, repeat it twice as well. But the minute it goes to a bigger breakpoint, a wider screen, let's say 3. Similarly, for a much wider screen, let's say 3 as well. All right, beautiful. Now you can see that it's actually aligned in a row. And if I right click on it and inspect, you can see that the grid is actually applied right here because these dotted lines are essentially shown when it's a CSS grid. And we also see there is some column gap as well. All right, that wraps up our layout. Now I'll see you in the next one, where we'll have a lot more fun building our app further.